Good evening and welcome to the Shrewsbury Historical Society. This is our May 2021 presentation. Thank you very much for joining our program tonight. We have a wonderful speaker planned. Next, we're going to have our curator's report. Christine Gustafson will report for us.
Hi, I'm Christine Gustafson, Vice President of the Shrewsbury Historical Society. Curator Linda Davis reported that some slides and VHS tapes were transferred to digital files and that a map was donated to the Society.
Okay, thank you. Next is our treasurer's report. Christine Gustafson will report also.
Treasurer Ann Folan reports that the Finance Committee met and set the new budget. It was approved by the Executive Board and also prepared the financial report. This will be in the annual report, which will be mailed to members along with a ballot. We greatly appreciate all of Ann's expertise as treasurer and a member of the Executive Board. She's truly a dedicated member. However, she will be retiring from her role as treasurer later this month. Thank you for your service, Ann.
Okay, in other business, we have three quick items to share. 2 scholarship awards have been presented to Holly Rusowski and Ella Caliger Maiori at High School Awards Night. Lauren Finicom received the Shrewsbury History Award, and Joseph McDonald and Christine Sizander received the Restoration and Preservation Award. The Society is in the process of replacing the 1830 sign above the south-facing door. The Executive Board recognizes Shrewsbury Media Connection staff with a certificate of appreciation for valuable assistance with scheduling programs and facilitating remote meetings this past year. Thank you to Mark Serra, Lori Bergman, Liz Poplowski, Krista Fogg, and Paul Gustafson. Now, the Shrewsbury Historical Society program tonight is 18th to early 20th century in Shrewsbury, Doctors in Their Times by Dr. B. Dale Magee. Dr. Magee.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. This is a topic which I hope you find as interesting as I have in researching it out. I'm going to cover Shrewsbury medicine and some physicians in Shrewsbury in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. And I'm going to give us a quick overview of the town to begin with, and then move through the topic. Now, Shrewsbury in the 1700s started, as many of you know already, in 1727. It was certified as a town with about 40 families, population growing to just under 1,000 by 1800. It was a small rural community, subsistence farming, maybe a mill or two, maybe some tanneries to deal with the leather that was an offshoot of the cows that were there. Little things like that, but basically people were taking care of themselves. There was not a lot of industry going on at that time. And medicine in the 1700s wasn't what we think of medicine being today. No one would consider it a science. You could go into a coma for a couple of hundred years and come back and still be up to date. In the 1700s, there were a few innovations that were introduced. Inoculation of smallpox in 1721 was popularized by Dr. Boylston in Boston, actually by his slave who taught him that. And obstetric forceps were popularized in the early 1700s to assist with difficult births. Not much else going on. Education was mostly, particularly in the United States, by apprenticing. You would spend a few years working with a doctor. They would train you, provide you with some tools and a certificate. There were very few schools in the colonies at that time. Harvard Medical School was going to be the only medical school in Massachusetts for some time, and it didn't start until 1784. But although the schools, there was a school eventually in 1784, they were just teaching theory, not based on science, based on tradition. There was no patient contact. They would have lectures for 3 or 4 months. Then people would go back to the farm, and then they'd come back and get the same lectures again, and then they would get an an oral exam and be turned loose. So education in those days was primitive at best. And the theories that they were learning had to do with balance. It was felt that disease either was a punishment for misbehaving in some way, or an imbalance of the humors in the body, the blood and the bile and other humors. And so if you were thought to be a little too ruddy, if you had a high fever, then they would decide that perhaps you had too much blood, and therefore bleeding you down might be a way of curing your illness. And the illustration with this slide is George Washington being cared for by the best medical minds at the time. He had contracted what was probably a strep infection, a severe strep infection in the throat that surrounded his windpipe as well. And they determined he had a temperature, he looked a little ruddy, he had too much blood. So they bled 40% of his blood volume down over about 12 hours. This did not do the trick for him. He did pass away either from his condition or from his treatment. But it goes to show that even the best medical minds at the time, dealing with America's most prominent citizen, were able to only do primitive and often wrong-minded things. If we look at what was the illnesses people got, how long people lived, things like that, infections played a huge role in both illness and death. And trauma, as you might expect, accidents, those sorts of things. The average lifespan was 40 or less. And much of this was also being driven by infant mortality. The number is over 100, maybe 150, and that's out of 100 out of 1,000 live births. So if a baby was born in this era, roughly 10 to 15% of them wouldn't make it to their first birthday, and probably the same number or greater wouldn't make it to their fifth birthday. In addition to that, childbirth was dangerous for the mother, and a mother's chances of dying in those days was roughly 1 or 2%. And if you have 5 or 6 children, then you're pushing those odds way up. Now, in addition to this, there were some tensions of the times, particularly around the Revolution. The people who moved to Shrewsbury didn't just come here because Boston was getting crowded. They came here because they wanted to get away from the aristocrats in Boston. They wanted to do things on their own. They were independent-minded. They became, as I mentioned, subsistence farmers. There was a moment in time when they had something in common with the people in Boston, though, and that was dealing with the Revolution. The aristocrats and elders in Boston didn't want to be told what to do by the crown, and certainly the people out in central Massachusetts didn't either. And so there was wide support for the Revolution, and we had lots of people who volunteered to fight. However, when it came time to approve the Constitution, Central Mass actually voted against it more than once because they felt there was a tendency towards centralizing power, and we were just substituting one central authority for another. Eventually, compromises were made, but there was this brewing tension there that they were going to lose the independence that they wanted so much. And into this comes Shays' Rebellion. Shay was a farmer who served in the Revolutionary War. When they served, they were promised for their service a payment, as well as the pride of having represented their new country. However, the new country didn't have money, and the new country felt that it needed to raise money by taxing people. And so the individuals who had served and not been paid were now being taxed and also taken to court where their property was being seized. And who is it who is prevailing in the court or presiding in the court in central Massachusetts? But Artemus Ward, the individual who had been their general in the Revolutionary War. And so this is why I have Artemus Ward's house in this slide. So Shay and many others who were appalled at what was going on came into Worcester, set up camp actually in Shrewsbury, and did so at one point across the street where Dean Park is today, across the street from Artemis Ward's house. He was apparently at that time expanding his mansion. And so this had the flavor of a revolutionary time, Occupy Wall Street, in which the people who felt that they were being taken advantage of were just getting in the face of those who were more well off. Artemis Ward had thousands of cases before him, and Shays' Rebellion persisted for a while. In the short run, they did not prevail, but in the long run, they did. Eventually, the governor was replaced, and their debts apparently were forgiven. But this builds a picture of who lives in Central Mass, who lives in Boston, a little bit of tension going on there. And into this comes Ebenezer Morse, who was educated at Harvard. He studied a broad number of things. His father wanted him to be a lawyer. He studied law, but he also studied medicine and apothecary and the ministry. He clerked for a while in Worcester, but really didn't find himself liking the law at all. And so he became certified as a minister and applied for a position here in Shrewsbury. Shrewsbury had been growing. The northern part, which is now Boylston, had an additional population. And the roads, particularly in those days, weren't particularly good. They were rutty. They could barely support a cart going up and down. And so if you were required to get to church every Sunday, if you were required to come into town meetings, it was getting very difficult, and there was a lot of rumbling in the north part that they wanted their own church and to make it easier for them. So there was a second precinct that was developed in Shrewsbury in 1742, and the first pastor of the second precinct was Ebenezer Morse. And so that is a position he served in and continued to serve in. He was a very intelligent person, little bit of a stickler for detail and the like. Everyone respected him, but he was constantly at war with the elders in the parish regarding his pay and raises and things like this. There was an underlying tension there, which came to a head in 1776 when Central Massachusetts, Shrewsbury in particular, was all in for the revolution. And Ebenezer Morse saw this as something he did not want to participate in. He was a royalist. And so that was the last straw for the elders in his parish. And they expelled him. They fired him. He fought them tooth and nail. He felt it was illegal. He didn't think they should do it. He took every avenue available to him. They prevailed, and he was out of a job. So on to Plan B and Plan C. And so at that point, after the revolution, he moved to practicing law and practicing medicine. And you can see here that you can see a couple of things from his journal as to how often he saw patients, what kinds of complaints he screened. And there are a couple of things to know here. One is that he, like most physicians of that time, wasn't earning his living completely in medicine. They had to do something else as well. There were only a few visits here. He had 13 visits in May of 1787, 18 in July. That was not enough. He was a traditionalist. He was bleeding his patients and bandaging them and the like. So he was practicing the usual medicine, well thought of in his community. But such was the life at that point of Ebenezer Morse. Well, tensions also were occurring in the medical field as well. In 1781, the Massachusetts Medical Society was formed by doctors primarily in Boston. And they included one from Rutland just to make it look like they were statewide. But basically, the 30 or so doctors who formed the nucleus were all from Boston and the immediate environs. And they got a charter from the Commonwealth to give them the authority to certify doctors. So if you wanted to, there was no licensing bureau by the state. So if you wanted to have that credential, you needed to go to Boston. You needed to satisfy these individuals who may or may not know you and may or may not respect you. And in addition to that, they limited their membership to 75 members. So the doctors in Worcester didn't think that was a particularly good idea. And on December 18th of 1794, 40 doctors met at the United States Arms Hotel at the corner of Main and Market Street in Worcester. And through their deliberations and everything, formed the Worcester Medical Society. Now, they elected at that time the secretary of that meeting, the person who was at the center of that meeting and transcribing everything, Dr. Ebenezer Morse. So our Dr. Morse was involved with founding the Worcester Medical Society. And that was a very important date, December 18th for us. We recently celebrated our 225th anniversary, and I just wanted you to know about him. Now, the story goes on a little bit because when the Worcester Society approached the Commonwealth and looked for authority to certify physicians in this area, the Massachusetts Medical Society was having none of it. And so there was this back and forth going on. The fight was a lot easier for them because they were all in Boston. And this went on for a decade. Eventually, the membership of the Massachusetts Medical Society started to wither. There were some newer, younger members of the society who were a little more conciliatory. And so in 1804, 10 years later, there was an agreement in which Worcester would become a district of the Massachusetts Medical Society and have all authority for certifying physicians west of Framingham. So thus, the Worcester District Medical Society came into being, and that is how it exists to this day. Well, let's move on to the 19th century. Shrewsbury in the 1800s went from a population of 900 plus or so, roughly 1,500 by the year 1900. So a little bit of growth, not wild. But to give you some comparison here, if we look at Worcester, Worcester began the 1800s with a population of around 2,500, and it began the 1900s with a population of about 110,000. The Industrial Revolution hit Worcester big time, having a canal, having railroads, having the capacity for factories and the like. It was under a tremendous growth. Here in Shrewsbury, minimal. Mills, leather, blacksmiths, those sorts of things, subsistence farming, pretty much the same. Now, if we look at medicine in the 1800s, it's really two eras. There's pre-1840 and then post-1840. Pre-1840, things didn't change much. That medicine I was talking about, restoring the balance of humors, was called heroic medicine. And I think the heroes here were the patients who subjected themselves to it because they often didn't do very well. But people were starting to look for alternatives. They wanted someone to care for them when they were sick. They wanted to take some medication to help them feel better. And so they looked for alternatives that may not have been as dangerous. And so into this period of time comes homeopathy from Germany, which involves using minuscule doses of that which has harmed you, and the idea of sort of building some sort of resistance to it. There was Thomsonianism from Vermont, which was focused on cleaning out the gastrointestinal tract by whatever means they could. And again, that was their version of restoring balance. Mesmerism from France, involving the power of hypnosis and the power of the mind to change people. Water cures were popular as well. That's what's included in this illustration in the slide. And so these were the other things that people were dabbling in. The illnesses of the time, again, infection, smallpox, despite the inoculation that was involved, was still a big thing, although Jenner, at the very turn of the century, introduced the modified virus, the cowpox virus, which was much safer, still effective, and made an enormous difference as the century progressed. But cholera came in as well, and so there were other infections, and it still dominated the diseases that people experienced. Trauma, again, playing a big role, and lifespan changed a little. still in the 40s, infant mortality still high, maternal mortality still high. All of these things didn't change much. And if you think about it, none of these treatments were really anything to expect to work. So it's not a shock that the results weren't that different. Now, into this comes Adolphus Brigham, a Shrewsbury physician, practiced here in Shrewsbury. I'll show you his house in another slide. But he lived here with his wife. He had a son, Franklin, who we'll talk about next. And he was someone who practiced medicine close to full time, although there were still other things that they did. Doctors in those days, as you can see from his record here from 1829, he's got a list of the fatal cases he dealt with. He has a list of the obstetric cases, the deliveries that he did during the year. So if you've got somebody who knows who's being born and who is dying, they're a great candidate for a town clerk. And many of them would function in town government a little bit as well. If we look at why his patients were dying in those days, typhus, no surprise there, pneumonia, again, marasmus, which is a sort of a form of starvation in an elderly patient, apoplexy, which is a stroke, again in an older patient, and opium overdose, which I hope wasn't the result of one of his treatments. But nonetheless, that is something to pay attention to here as well, because some of the substances that they were getting either on the street or from their doctors, again, could do harm, and that will come up in a little bit as well. If we look at his doctor bag, and this photograph comes from the Shrewsbury Historical Society, we can see some instruments here that involve dentistry. We can see a tourniquet, which may have been used for an amputation. This was before anesthesia most of his time. And so if somebody needed a amputation, basically 3 or 4 sturdy men would hold the person down, a tourniquet would be put on, and someone would work very fast to get the limb off. And just a few big doses or big gulps of alcohol would be all that they had to kill the pain. Drugs provided by the doctors were generally compounded by the doctors, and there was no standardization. So one doctor's little red pill may be different from another doctor's little red pill. So that introduced yet another hazard. Oliver Wendell Holmes in Boston did introduce a pharmacopoeia in the early century produced by the Massachusetts Medical Society to try to provide recipes that would introduce a level of standardization. Whether they were always followed or not is uncertain. Now here's his house. It's across from the Patton School on Grafton Street, and it is there to this day. Now, if we take the second era, now we start to see medicine start to become associated with science, start to look like the medicine that we recognize. And so a number of things start to happen. And what's interesting is that when a breakthrough occurs, very often it's the result of a lot of work going on in several different places at once. And so it is not unusual to have similar breakthroughs or 2 people at the same time come up with the same idea. And so it was with a number of things. I had mentioned that a woman's chance of dying in childbirth was roughly 1 or 2%. And to give you some background on this, today it's about 1 in 10,000. So, talk about successes in medicine. From 1 in 50 to 1 in 10,000 is a pretty good success. But at the root of childbed fever, which was an infection, was work done by Semmelweis in Vienna and Oliver Wendell Holmes in Boston. They used 2 very different approaches to the problem, but both of them came to the same conclusion, and that is that the person who was doing the delivery was in some way carrying something with them to the next patient that they saw, and therefore causing an epidemic or spreading disease. And therefore cleaning the hands and the clothes and the like would be an important thing to do. There was no theory along with this. Nobody knew about bacteria. Nobody knew about hygiene. And so there was no theory to go along with it. People the traditional physicians were happy with the idea of a miasma, some illness traveling in the air that was behind this. And so there was not a rapid acceptance of this idea. Both Semmelweis and Holmes really had difficulty getting people to change. Holmes, after probably 15 or 20 years, almost just gave up on it. Semmelweis became more and more militant with his colleagues, eventually went mad and died in a madhouse. But those discoveries were made and medicine eventually moved forward. Meanwhile, in the 1840s, Morton, a Charlton dentist who was practicing in Boston, discovered the value of ether. Horace Wells, a dentist practicing in Hartford, discovered the value of nitrous oxide. Crawford Long, a surgeon in Georgia, also nearly the same time, actually before Morton discovered the value of ether. And James Young Simpson in Scotland, an obstetrician, discovered chloroform as a good anesthetic. All of them made the discoveries the same way at a party. They had noticed that they were having a nitrous oxide party, a laughing gas party, and having a good time. People would fall, injure themselves, and experience no pain and no memory of it. And so these individuals put two and two together and saw an opportunity to innovate and to introduce these substances into surgery. And as a result of the development of anesthesia in the mid-1840s, we have rapid advances in surgery and the capacity to correct intra-abdominal problems that were inaccessible prior to that. Meanwhile, in the 1850s, Florence Nightingale in England during the Crimea War, and John Snow, also in England during a cholera epidemic, discovered the value of cleanliness and hygiene. This was another component, not immediately connected to this whole bacterial theory, but people found that if you scrub things down, if you keep things neat and clean, people end up being healthier, and that was a rapid advance. And in and of itself, probably did more to improve the lifespan and certainly things like infant mortality than almost anything else. Meanwhile, in the 1850s to the 1870s, Pasteur in France, Koch in Germany, Lister in Scotland, all moved the idea of germ theory forward, and the fact that using various substances can cut down the chance of bacteria causing an infection. In this illustration we have here is Lister operating, and so this is a mister in the corner. They were using carbolic acid, and they would have a mist of carbolic acid. They would wash their hands, they would clean the abdomen, they would put bandages on after the surgery soaked in carbolic acid, and remarkable improvement in the outcomes as a result of that. But notice also, no IV, no IVs in those days, no masks, no gown, no gloves. Those were to come later. Education in those days was a real mixed bag. Even Harvard Medical School had no pre-medical requirements. And in fact, over half in the mid-1800s, over half of their students were not literate, and basically they stayed in business by giving people oral exams. And this was at a time when, as we find that there are things that doctors can do that make a difference, education becomes even more important. And so they begin to introduce the idea of pre-medical education, of getting a high school diploma, maybe even a college degree before going to medical school. They begin to extend the time of study a little bit more. So those sorts of things begin to get introduced. The illnesses, infection, again, the majority of illness and mortality, trauma. But as people begin to live a little bit longer, you start to see more in the way of cardiovascular disease, and the lifespan begins to extend into the 50s during this span of time. Now, there's another thing that popped up during the mid-19th century, and this is patent medicines. Again, people looking for alternatives. They weren't so sure about the doctors. Even if they wanted to go to the doctor, they had to get on their horse, find the doctor, get the doctor to come out to the house if the person could not move. It was a big deal. And so they were looking for ways to take care of themselves. And there were a number of hucksters who were more than happy to meet their needs. And you can see that it was just open season on drugs. So if your baby is having toothache, try some cocaine. Asthma cigarettes, not a bad idea. Soothing syrup here probably had opium in it. And cannabis in this liquid here as well. Most of them had lots of alcohol, and many of them promised anything. Here in Shrewsbury, we had Phelps Arcanum. And although in this promotion he identifies himself as being from Worcester, Mass., he practiced here in Shrewsbury from 1835 until he died in 1843. And this particular substance promised to cure anything. So consumption, which is what they called tuberculosis then, syphilis, liver disease, kidney disease. If you had it, this would cure it. He was very obscure in his explanations as to how it worked, but he made it available to everyone. Now, the medical society during this time was way focused, as you might expect, on this sort of thing. And on the one hand, we're dealing with the fact that even legitimate medicine at that time didn't have a lot of science behind it. And on the other hand, there were people who just went over the limit and really were clearly a danger to the community. And so what the medical society, where they landed, was if you were selling something that you would not reveal the contents of, you were keeping it a secret, then they would expel you. And that is how they handled that. That, of course, didn't stop Dr. Phelps. Now, into this comes Franklin Brigham, and Adolphus's son. He has a more formal education. He goes to Harvard Medical School. He serves for a couple of years in the armed services, and then he comes back to Shrewsbury to practice, and he has a large, very busy practice. You can see his medications here as well, and his tools as shown in an exhibit at the Shrewsbury Historical Society. Very popular, very busy, and very active in the medical society, giving the oration on progress in medicine and reflections regarding that, which is a great time to do that, and also serving in the 1890s as president of the Worcester Medical Society before dying in 1899 of pneumonia after just a very brief illness. Now, if we look at where he was located, it was near the fork of Main Street and Maple Street. So here we are with a very old picture, and Main is going straight into the picture. Off to the left is Maple Street, and his house would be to the right there. It is there to this day. 535 Main Street is where Franklin Brigham had his house and his very busy practice. Now, the other thing that was an innovation of the 1800s was the introduction of hospitals, particularly late in the century. And although I'm not going to talk about a hospital in Shrewsbury, I wanted to paint a picture of some that some of you may know of. The first is the State Lunatic Asylum, the Worcester State Hospital, which initially opened where the post office is in downtown Worcester in 1833 with 120 or so beds. It was the first state institution that advocated for the humane treatment of the mentally ill. And they quickly filled up, and with the demand being what it was, they built a new facility. What we're looking at here is a facility that existed on Plantation Street in Worcester, across from where UMass Memorial is now, and it was built with a capacity of over 1,000. And actually it became more and more crowded, and in the mid-1900s actually housed 2,000 patients, which is an enormous capacity. But they used it for research, they used it for training. The care was felt to have elevated to a higher level, and they also opened up a farm called Hillside Farm on Lake Street here in Shrewsbury to allow people to grow vegetables and the like, and also because many of the people who were at the asylum, when they passed away, no one claimed their body. They also had a cemetery here in Shrewsbury at the Hillside Farm on Lake Street. And so that is the connection between Shrewsbury and the Worcester State Hospital. Now, Worcester City Hospital in 1871 grew from the need to treat patients who were poor. Doctors in the community would volunteer there. Doctors in training would train there. It had a very good reputation. And you can see here, there were so many buildings. This is down by Queen Street in Worcester, that it almost looked like a city in itself. But it had a very good reputation and functioned until it was taken over by UMass Memorial in the 1990s. This is the earliest Memorial Hospital, which was opened in 1888. And it is the result of a endowment by Ichabod Washburn, who was an industrialist in Worcester. And it was a memorial to his daughters, Lucy and Eliza, who predeceased him. So if you're curious as to why they call it Memorial, that's why they call it Memorial. It initially was a hospital for women and children and functioned as that until about 1909. It also was a place for trainees and trained more than its share of female physicians at that time. St. Vincent Hospital was the result of the bishop and the Sisters of Providence meeting a need since they felt that the traditions and concerns of Catholics weren't necessarily being met by Memorial Hospital, and so they began St. Vincent Hospital, and this is a shot of early St. Vincent Hospital in 1893. This hospital grew, as you know, it continues to this day, and actually in the 1950s was the second largest hospital in the state, second only to Massachusetts General Hospital. Hospitals in general have dialed down quite a bit since then, but it is a remarkable success. And then finally, Hermann Hospital, started in 1896 and named for the German doctor who began homeopathy. And it was a homeopathic hospital initially until the early 1900s when it started practicing more traditional medicine. But again, Hermann Hospital continued until the 1990s when it merged with UMass Memorial. So we have this introduction of hospitals, an enhanced level of ability to treat illness, some scientific theories behind what is causing some illnesses, and increasing attention as to the importance of education. And so it is with this that we move into the 20th century. And Shrewsbury in the 1900s also was undergoing some remarkable changes. The population, as I said, was roughly 1,500. It was actually 1,626 in the 1900 census, but it was undergoing rapid growth. It had doubled by 1920 and doubled again by 1930. So it was undergoing the most rapid growth of its history. And this is likely due to the fact that we had better roads, we had transportation, we had trolleys, there was electricity being provided, water and sewer were being introduced, wealthier individuals from Worcester were putting up summer homes here, and so connections were being made and people were moving in, it was growing. So there were a lot of interesting changes. Medicine in the early 1900s also was undergoing a lot of changes. Education and its certification was improving. No longer was it just the medical society who was certifying people, but the Massachusetts took responsibility with the Board of Registration in Medicine in 1894 to license physicians. And Abraham Flexer, working on a grant from the Carnegie Foundation and at the behest of several organizations, including the American Medical Association, in 1910, visited every medical school in the country, and in a very succinct way analyzed what their resources were, what the quality of their education was, and basically promoted the notion of improving medical education using a model of the Johns Hopkins model. He was a professor at Johns Hopkins, so that came naturally to him. But Johns Hopkins, which opened in 1892, introduced a lot of things. They required a college degree before getting in. They had 2 years of basic science that you would learn during classwork that went most of the year, and then followed by 2 years of clinical training with working in a hospital. And the Johns Hopkins Hospital was designed to be part of the medical school. So he used this standard and applied this template to all the medical schools in the country, and they were all over the place. The quality of education could be any one of a number of things. A lot of them were just degree mills. They had practically no lab facilities, no connection to a hospital, and he let you know that in his report. The report got a lot of publicity, a lot of attention, and nearly half of the medical schools in the United States and Canada closed in the decade that followed. Roughly 70 medical schools closed out of the 155 that there were in the country at that time. And in general, the standard of education improved. And in fact, the template of a bachelor's degree, 2 years of basic science, and 2 years of clinical persists to this day in medical schools. In addition to this, all of those proprietary meds that I showed you on an earlier slide led to more than a few bad outcomes. And as a result of attention to that, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was passed, which required that drugs be safe and that they be pure and consistently made. And so this was a standard that was applied at that time. And this gave rise to the Food and Drug Administration that we know today. Note that I didn't say they needed to be effective. So basically, they wanted to protect people from getting killed or injured from the medications, but the requirement that a drug that is approved by the FDA be effective did not come in until the 1960s. Surgery was safer, but there still were no antibiotics. And the illustration here is an operation taking place in the very early 1900s. This here is Michael Fallon doing an operation at St. Vincent Hospital. And what I want you to see here, Michael Fallon was not a Shrewsbury resident. His son John was, who succeeded him. But what we see here is he's got gowns on, he's got masks on, hoods, so much more attention to sterility than was occurring earlier. And it should be noted that Michael Fallon was a very advanced physician. He frequently, at his own option, would travel to the Mayo Clinic and study new techniques there and try to bring them back to Worcester and to his practice. Again, in those days, infections were dominating, trauma, cardiovascular disease. The average lifespan in the early 1900s was getting into the 50s. Infant mortality was still in the low hundreds kind of range. And so most of the advances in infant mortality that were occurring then probably were the result of hygiene. And I would say also addressing the infections that in 1906, I believe it was, or 08, the Worcester Medical Society started a medical milk commission because every summer children would start to get gastrointestinal illnesses, and many would be very ill and many would die. And this appeared to be the result of production of milk that was occurring. It was not pasteurized in those days, even though Pasteur invented that technique 50 years earlier. And so they would inspect for storage, for cooling facilities and the like, and try to increase the safety of the milk that was being served to the children at that time. Now, talking about health in the early 1900s, you've got to talk about the Great Influenza. And this occurred in 1918. Many feel that it started at Fort Riley in Kansas in the spring of 1918. as the U.S. was gearing up to get into World War I, and essentially traveled across the U.S. with the troop movements and into Europe and essentially around the world. It was an enormous pandemic before it was done, killed at least 50 million people, and some estimates are much higher. In the United States, 675,000 people died. And to give you some perspective regarding that, roughly 175,000 soldiers died in World War I. So 5 times as many people, 4 or 5 times as many people died of the influenza as actually died in World War I. And in Fort Devens, just north of here, 15,000 cases were recorded, 800 deaths. In Worcester, there were 1,300 deaths. Here in Shrewsbury, we had maybe a dozen, maybe 2 dozen in the fall. And I'd mentioned it started at Fort Riley in the spring, moved over to Europe. What ended up happening is that a new strain developed in Europe and swung around and came back to the United States in the fall of 1918. And so when it came back with the title of the Spanish flu. And it is very likely that the reason it got that title is simply that the people in Spain were a little more transparent about the number of cases they had and the devastation that they were experiencing. Here in the United States, information was essentially suppressed. It was felt that it was something that could benefit the enemy if they knew how sick people were here, and so it was kind of business as usual. Now, the other point to make about the influenza, because we've had this COVID-19 pandemic for a little over a year now, is that masks were recommended then, and they weren't universally embraced. And so what I have on this slide here in the lower right corner is a headline from the San Francisco Chronicle that outlines the fact that a blacksmith in San Francisco who refused to wear a mask was approached by 3 public health officials to cite him for his behavior, and he took out a gun and shot all 3. Very often we romanticize the past and the solidarity that citizens may show, but certainly there was more than a little resistance to these public health measures even then. Well, let's move forward and talk about another doctor, Homer Gage, who was born in 1861. He trained at Harvard. He trained at Massachusetts General Hospital, was a surgeon, and a very high reputation. Actually, surgeons at Massachusetts General were known to say that he was considered the best surgeon in Massachusetts at the time. And getting that sort of endorsement from the surgeons at Mass General for a doctor who's practicing here in Worcester is something great indeed. He was a leader in the Worcester District Medical Society. He gave the oration of 40 Years of Progress, which again was a good idea, not terribly unlike Dr. Brigham's oration, and admonished people to pay more attention to public health, which was an admonishment that would come in handy a few years later. And also in 1908, likely spurred the participation in the Medical Milk Commission. He was president of our Worcester district in 1913. Now, the reason I'm talking about him is not just that he was a prominent physician. He lived here in Shrewsbury at what was the Flint Farm, and he and his wife Mabel purchased hundreds of acres of land in that area. They took the mansion that was at Flint Farm, moved it back and expanded it, produced many gardens around it, ran a farm and the like. And again, that is a building which to this day exists here in Shrewsbury. Now, he also was very successful in business. He was on many boards. He had one of those organizational minds that could look at a problem and try to figure out how to solve it. He was CEO of Crompton and Knowles, a position he probably didn't have a lot of competition with because Mabel, his wife's maiden name was Knowles, and it was her family that owned the company. But still, he was felt to have done an excellent job in that position. And as their wealth grew, They became philanthropists and actually began the Fondation des États-Unis in Paris, which was a facility that American students could go to study at the University of Paris. This exists to this day, and you can actually go to their website and they will have a tribute to Mabel and Homer Gage. So a very interesting extra dimension to this individual. But the reason I'm including him in this list is that he helped with the organization of the Massachusetts Medical Society. He was a counselor from Worcester to the Massachusetts Medical Society. And at that time, and actually from its origin in 1784, the Medical Society would produce a couple of publications. They would produce one that was kind of news, who joined, who died, who's going to a meeting. And so they'd have that news they'd publish, and in addition, they'd try to publish medical updates and keep everyone up to date. Well, into this comes the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, which has existed in one form or another since 1812. Always privately owned, always highly respected, always considered to be a great source of medical information, never making money. And so they were struggling, and so he felt that if the medical journal could accommodate the medical society, that it would make sense to affiliate. Make the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal the official journal of the Massachusetts Medical Society, have them print the news in the journal as well as all the up-to-date information. He raised dues by $5. He immediately gave the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal a large group of people to subscribe, and so that was the theory that Homer Gage brought forward. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, and they continued to lose money. And so in 1921, the Massachusetts Medical Society assumed ownership of the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal. They bought it for $1. They infused a little bit of more money and kept it floating. And in 1928, this journal was renamed the New England Journal of Medicine, a change that came into place because its influence was beginning to spread. As you can probably imagine, since this is quoted so often on the news, articles in the New England Journal very often get immediate attention. And it is at this point in time the foremost medical journal in the world. There is a number called the impact factor that gets at how often articles in the journal are quoted. And although the exact number doesn't matter that much, this will give you some perspective. The number for the New England Journal is about 75. The next runner-up, which is an English journal called The Lancet, is 65, and then under that is the Journal of the American Medical Association at about 45. Most other journals are in the range of 5 to 15. So this is a journal that it really is dominant at this point in time, reflects a very good investment on the part of the New England Journal of Medicine, and because of the advertising revenue that has grown from both its popularity and the growth of the pharmaceutical industry, it has become very profitable for the organization. Now, the last physician I'm going to talk to you about is Major Howard Beal. And many of you know that name. If you're from Shrewsbury, you've likely driven by Beal School and seen Major Howard Beal on the wall there. He was born in Maine, educated at Phelps Andover. He went to Harvard Medical School, graduated in 1898. He then went to Massachusetts General, where he trained in surgery. And shortly after graduation, entered the Army military service and went to the Philippines for 3 years. He returned, married Henrietta Hobbs of Shrewsbury, and began his practice in 1903. He was admitted to the Medical Society in 1903, and was practicing at a home that was provided for him by his father-in-law, Henrietta Hobbs' father. This was a building today known as the Bull Mansion. It is at 55 Pearl Street in Worcester, a huge mansion, and they lived there, and he practiced there. This continued for a while, and during this time, he was troubled by the fact that he felt that the U.S. was not well prepared from a medical point of view in case another war occurred. And so he actually traveled to Washington, spoke to the authorities in the Army, and made the recommendation that they develop a medical reserve corps so doctors could be identified, who could be helpful, trained in ways that would be unique to wartime medicine, and kept on reserve. They accepted his recommendation, began the Medical Reserve Corps, and that was an innovation which he introduced. In 1914, he saw that World War I was beginning. The United States did not want to get into the war, but Howard Beal did. He felt it was his obligation. He felt that he needed to be a part of that and help. And so he left his practice in 1914 and took the first boat over with the Red Cross and served in England and spent a year there. And we can see him here practicing in a club in Worcester. Here's our man Howard. This is the Owl Club, which was another medical organization in addition to the Medical Society that he was participating in at that time. And I just find this picture to be a beautiful illustration of his involvement in his profession at the time. Now, with regard to the work he did in England, Queen Mary actually visited him at the hospital that he was working at and thanked him for his efforts. And this made the Evening Gazette here in Worcester at the time and brought some attention to the work that he was doing. Now, he returned. I can say that he never quite was at peace with the idea of being here. Business as usual just didn't seem ethical for him. The notion that he needed to serve in the military tugged at his heartstrings. And so when the United States committed to enter World War I, he was all in. He appeared in April of 1918 at the Worcester Medical Society and encouraged people to either volunteer to go over or to become part of the Medical Reserve Corps. He then opened up a recruiting station in the center of Worcester to work on that. In this time, in addition, or I should say just before this time, he and his wife moved out of the Bull Mansion and moved back to Shrewsbury, where they lived at the Water Lane Farm likely on Lake Avenue, just southeast of where the new Beal School is going. So they were living there from 1912 on, and then 1918, he gets ready to go to England. And June, he leaves, actually 1917, I'm sorry. June, he leaves and gets over there. He writes letter after letter to his wife, and I thought I'd read you a few excerpts of those, just to give you a flavor of the man and the times. He would begin many of them, and roughly 45 or 50 of these survive. He would begin many of them with, "My dear Henrietta, last night I got into my wool pajamas, put on my fur coat, and then got into the blankets and put on my overcoat over it all, and I still was not warm." The image of someone in the middle of World War I putting on their pajamas is kind of interesting, but it's an interesting little tidbit. The next letter comes with, "The money Conrad," and that would be her brother, "sent, I thought could best be spent on clothing for poor kids in the near villages. So the names of 50 needy were obtained from the mayors of the villages. However, when word got out, 300 came. Our 50 packages were distributed and the mayors made speeches. I hope that you are taking good care of yourself. Good night, Howard." So these are the feelings that you get from the man, and reading these letters is a sheer pleasure. Now, combat continued, and on Thursday, July 18th, 1918, in the evening, he was in his tent and was called out by some soldiers who needed some directions. He went out to assist them, and a plane flew overhead and dropped a bomb which landed nearby. A piece of shrapnel entered his chest, and he sustained a hopeless injury. And so I'm going to read you a few words from his obituary, one from a friend who accompanied him in the hospital and describes how he greeted his wound. It said, after being wounded, he was lying perfectly quiet, and at first I thought he was asleep. But when I spoke to him, he opened his eyes and answered. We had a little talk together. He described his wound and seemed perfectly calm and self-possessed. I left him with a feeling that I had seldom seen a finer sight in the way in which a great, strong man had met such an accident. Later on, Major Homer Gage, his colleague, stated his professional skill, his industry, his good judgment made him an exceedingly valuable man to the community and to the institutions which he faithfully served. But to all who had the privilege of enjoying his friendship, it was the character and the personality of the man that can never be forgotten. His modesty, his gentleness, his kindness, and eager willingness to do for others made him always a delightful companion. And so this is the man for whom we have named our local high school, and this is a good way for us to end this talk today. This is a portrait of him that is at the the Shrewsbury Historical Museum, and gives, I think, a nicer picture than the usual one we see of him in military garb. So summing up, I think medicine has evolved a great deal in our community. We've changed, doctors have changed, the illnesses fortunately have evolved. Shrewsbury has a variety of physicians who've had an impact not just on their patients but on the community. And through the years, our society has provided a platform for enabling us to work together for the good of the community. There are a number of people I'd like to thank. There were so many people who were helpful to me in doing this, but certainly Linda Davis and Chris Gustafson of the Historical Society, Mike Perna, our historian in Shrewsbury, who provided those letters from the Beals, and the Worcester Historical Society, Wendy Essery, who was a tremendous source of information for me. And I thank you for the opportunity to give this talk.
Thank you very much. That was very wonderful. That was really nice. Our next presentation is on September 22nd, 2021. This is our first presentation back at the Old Historical Society. Our presentation is cider making by Dennis Picard. So I'm hoping to see everyone there. Thank you very much.